Obviously, during COVID, everyone's trying to understand what's happening. Pharma is developing these vaccines, trying to get them to market. And that was the first time that I saw pharma companies sort of change the type of projects that I saw coming in. Okay, what is health equity? How do we increase data sets from women and global majority populations? And disparity in the data sets in communities, when engaging communities, I saw how that affected uptake. And then, of course, from a pharma perspective, I saw the commercialization opportunity. Then I thought, okay, let's figure out what SökerData would be.
Elsa Zekeng, welcome to the Healthtech podcast. How are you?
Hi, James. Thank you for having me. I am well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, I've had a very good day. The buzz of making a sale never leaves you, I don't think. And it's funny, like you can make it. Yeah, thank you for the claps. Yeah, for those watching on YouTube, you'll have seen that. It was a muted clap, so you might not have heard it on audio. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting, isn't it? Like you. It's funny, depending on what the P&L looks like, depends on whether it's a relief or it's a really good thing that's like super, let's like crack the champagne. This one was a bit of a relief, if I'm being honest. So without giving too much away. So I was like, oh, finally, another retainer.
I love that. But I mean, your Q1, it's Q1, it's January. I mean,
it's January. Got it in before the end of January. Yeah,
exactly. So I think either way, hit the ground running.
Plenty to be proud of. And exactly. I'm proud of myself, Elsa. That's the thing. My reward mechanism is internal. Proud of myself.
That is the way to go. I mean, sometimes you need it.
Trust me, sometimes you do need it. The problem was actually. Let's get into this. The problem was right. Let's add some detail here. Towards the end of last year, this is just typical end of year stuff. Everyone's like, "Oh, I need to get my invoices in before end of December, before end of year." So basically, you know, I'm throwing out all these invoices, and people are paying them. I'm like, okay. Wow, okay, this is fantastic. Like but then the end of year numbers for last year look a bit too good because now I've got to do all the work. So now I've got no revenue. I've just got loads of costs in Q1. So my P&L for last year looks amazing, and now I've got a rubbish P&L for Q1 of this year, which is why it's a bit of a relief. But this is all just how it looks. The cash remains the same, but at the end of the day, this is running a bootstrap business. This is the stuff that VC-backed people just don't even need to worry about.
Didn't realize that you're bootstrapped, James. But I think that's
totally bootstrapped. Yeah, totally bootstrapped. It's a really simple business model. We just spend less than we earn each month.
Surprise.
It's beautifully straightforward. Yeah. It's then you make this thing called profit, which is like amazing. But profit's incredible because if you take your eye off it, it starts decreasing. So you've constantly got to keep your eye on it, and you've constantly got to watch it, and you've constantly got to fight for every pound of profit. It's super interesting.
I love that because again, even if you're VC backed, at the end of the day, it's always cash flow management, right?
100%.
And whether like cash flow management and profit, because otherwise it's just an expensive hobby, which is fine. You know,
no, it's true.
If we could pay for that expensive
What's the
hobby,
phrase? They say, is it revenue for vanity, profit for sanity, cash for reality? I think that's the...
I
ever heard that?
Heard that one. No, not heard that one. Okay.
Never a true word
Say that
spoken
again. Say that again.
Revenue for vanity, profit for sanity, cash for reality.
There you go, folks. If you
go.
take anything away from this podcast,
if you take anything away, take that away. And that you can quote James Somaru, 27th of January. Definitely no one has said that before me. That's all mine, Elsa, actually. Yeah.
IP trademark stamp.
It's definitely not all mine at all. I think it's quite a well-known phrase, but anyway. Let's talk about some data stuff. So you're the founder of SökerData, which I should have said at the beginning, and you are doing all sorts of interesting stuff. SökerData, curating health data from minority groups, creating unbiased health data sets, training your AI, powering clinical trial decisions, obviously working with pharma and that side of the world. And you've also done that with just on the back of an incredibly interesting career. So why don't you give our audience a bit of a flavor of what you've been up to?
How did I get here? That's the $1 million question, isn't it? So really, I'm a scientist.
Yeah.
At my core, I've forever been obsessed with science. And I think I was thinking about this podcast, thinking about how I got here. And very much the question and the thought that kept coming to my mind is I'm really just forever be a 7-year-old curious kid. And I always
Yeah.
say 7-year-old because that's the age that I ran my first experiment. And it was very much a home experiment, very straightforward. But I realized that I've just never moved on from that. And
What was the first experiment is the obvious question here.
mm,
Surely
yeah,
you knew I was going to ask that
I
question.
knew. I was like, also, we're gonna go down this
Oh no,
road.
did you kill something
Uh,
or like dissect something? Of
dissected
course
something.
you did. You dissected something, of course. Yeah, yeah.
I'm like animals.
Perfect.
Honestly, no animals were harmed in the making of the experiment. Essentially, I was trying to understand the movement of ants in my garden, in the garden, so
Okay.
my garden, my parents' garden at home,
Yeah.
and what factors were going to make them continue moving down a specific path versus not. And I was inserting different food items to understand if the food items were going to take them off the path or not. And the funny joke here is that it ended up backfiring on me because I then tried a few things and they were not moving, or they just kept going down a specific path. Then I went, "Oh, my mom has planted some Scotch bonnets. Let me go and bring out some Scotch bonnets
Oh.
and put them in." Exactly, you know where the story's going. So I go find the Scotch bonnets, pull them out, put them in, and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, they're completely changing direction." But then again, as a 7-year-old kid, I threw it down and then I rubbed my eyes. I
Yeah,
was like, "Oh my
nice.
gosh." And I was like, "Mm-hmm." So then my mom
Perfect.
rushes down to a scream from the garden, like, "What is going on?" And then all I remember is laying in bed that night with like cold towels on my eyes. Because yeah,
Oh.
that was the interesting part about my curiosity where that led me. But I've not changed from that kid really. Just constantly
Fantastic.
curious. Yeah.
Fantastic. An innocent curiosity in the world. I love it. I
Well,
love
that's
it.
sad. No, but that translated to uni and I mean I did my A levels, all was complete science. Then uni I did molecular biology. I worked at a lab in Manchester. At the time, I did not realize that they were a startup, but now I know that they were a startup. And it was founded by two ex-AZ AstraZeneca colleagues who had left AZ and then started this company on precision medicine. And that was the
Mm.
first time I learned about precision medicine and that we were all different and reacted differently to chemos. And we were essentially trying to find out the best chemo option for a
Mm.
specific patient. So we were getting samples from the Christie Hospital in Manchester and then actually working through with the oncologist to understand what was the best treatment pathway for a specific patient. And being the curious kid I was, continued down that path to do a PhD. And that really was just because my company at the time sponsored some PhD students. So I would see the work that they would do. And I thought, of course, I would want to carry on learning more. And then I went on to do a PhD, which title wise is in infectious diseases and global health. But I make that distinction because the PhD in itself was focusing on data sets and how we could find biomarkers to distinguish specific populations or subpopulations. And so the hypothesis there, because this was back in 2030 when I started my PhD. So I didn't do a master's. I finished my BSc, went straight to my PhD. And the hypothesis was that we would do another pandemic. Now, we
Right.
thought at the time it was going to be a flu pandemic because at that time, the previous flu pandemic was in 2009, I believe. And so we thought, okay, we'll do another flu pandemic and everyone's going to be rushing to the ER, to A&E rather, saying, oh, we have flu-like symptoms, right? But how do you distinguish and triage for flu-like symptoms? So then the thought was, okay, how can we create a sort of pregnancy test, right, based on a biomarker that we can actually triage which patients actually are more likely to develop flu or those that could actually, well, probably go home and they're just
Hmm.
symptoms that could be treated at home. And so that was basically what led me down this data rabbit hole that I clearly have not come out from. So,
Amazing.
yeah.
And just to pull out one thing that I saw in your career, advisory board member, science and industry museum. So very much satisfying that curious innocence of the 7-year-old there to be part of a science museum. That is so cool. What do you do for them?
No, that was really cool. I say was, still is, because I am still on the board. Been on the board since 2020, and that's specifically for the Science Industry Museum in Greater Manchester.
Mm.
And essentially, we sit around on, long days. They're long days, probably 8-hour days, and just curate different exhibitions that are coming out. And we're planning
Wow.
like 2 to 3 year ahead, exactly. And so it's constantly like,
Wow.
what can you get? What could this exhibition look like? Who is it going to attract? Are we bringing in stuff that are going to attract different members of the public, right? And to take you a bit back into why that role was quite important for me. So yes, I talk about science, but I also come from a background from which both my parents are scientists, right? So really being in science was more the norm than than the exception. Um, so there was that, but then there was also the fact that I went to all girls school. Now, when you say those 2 points, you say the difference between nature and nurture. There are lots of studies that have shown that girls stay in science longer depending on like their home environment versus if they went to all girls schools. Actually, there's a study that said that if you girls went to all girls schools, they were most likely to stay in science longer. Right, and I didn't even know that, right? But so my whole life I've been surrounded by this and I didn't quite realize how much of a privilege that was until I then started learning that some girls were rather not stay in science because maybe they were in classes and then they felt like they did not belong, or not say they were bullied, but they were maybe teased and felt like they were going
Oh,
to
because they
defect
would be
or
in the minority in STEM subjects, I
exactly
imagine. Yeah,
in
okay.
STEM subjects versus they didn't feel like they could put up their hands to ask questions, answer questions. If
Yes.
they said something wrong, they might be teased by the boys and things like that.
Wow.
And you can imagine like teenage years, like lots of things happen. But then again, I don't even know that experience because I literally was in all girls school up until the age of
Wow.
17 when I went to uni. So I believe that that was a huge cocoon that just kept me on that and has kept me on this path. And so being on the Science and Industry Museum board, a key part was how do we create an atmosphere where if you don't have that at home, you can come into a space that can recreate that for you. Right. And so it was okay. Every time I look at exhibitions and curations coming up, the question in the back of my mind was, okay, if a young girl came in and she was interested, and maybe for whatever reason she was considering leaving science because of her environment, this should hopefully make her consider staying in.
Mm.
And so, yeah, there are lots of really cool exhibitions that we went into. So some around like GCHQ and like Bletchley Park and everything
Wow.
around that, and lots of other things around the cotton industrial part in Manchester and the railway. And so, yeah, that very much it's been really, it's my little way of giving back and creating a space for other people who may not have had what I had growing up.
What was
So
it like seeing little girls go to those exhibitions after you'd thought about that design just so intentionally?
oh my God, it was the questions. It was just seeing their faces light up and just having an understanding of what it was. So there was even another one on cancer, for example, and HeLa cells. So the Henrietta Lacks cells that I remember we did and was touring around between London and Manchester as well. And just the
Mm.
little girls going in and having the questions and asking what, you know, one could argue are the most simple questions, but then that's what sparks the interest and is that curiosity. Like I love questions. I'm always asking questions. So it's just seeing how in real time someone else or this little girl is connecting dots, like, oh,
Mm.
what is a cell and what is this and what's the consequence of this? And just knowing that it's something that they could potentially go into or they would like to, even if it's to take it for one more year at school, like that's the job done, right? So yeah.
It's amazing. I've got 1-year-old and it's a 1-year-old boy, but the thought that any part of the world would be closed off to him because of the fear of judgment is just heartbreaking. Like it genuinely is. And to think that, that's the case and girls not going into STEM subjects as a result. It's such a real, it's such a, I don't know, it's very confronting. just seems very real at the minute, particularly just seeing the innocence of a 1-year-old running around and thinking he just thinks the whole world is built for him at the moment. Like he doesn't
Love
see
that.
any nonsense in the world currently. And
Yeah,
as a parent, you just want to preserve that as long as possible. And in part,
exactly.
it's let's correct what we can about the world to make just people feel like they belong, for God's sake. Like it's really, really nice. Also, I've just written the word human down and put a massive ring around it, because like I imagine we're going to talk about AI quite a lot, but it's a very human problem to solve. It's a very human problem, actually, and it's a very social science human problem, isn't it? And actually solving it yourself, and the difference you make to those individuals doing something like that is just amazing. Anyway, the rest of your career, do you want to just plot the path from that PhD up to being a founder? Because you're not the sort of person that was like, oh, I had my first business at the age of 4 and, born entrepreneur and selling things. You haven't described that type. I mean, that might be about you, but you haven't described that so far. But you've done lots of things and then become a founder, which is quite relatable. I think particularly relatable to me. And I imagine a few people listening. So what is your journey through building up the skills, the confidence, even the idea and the area and all that sorts of stuff? Like, talk me through that.
Absolutely. I mean, what comes to mind when I think about that is that there are two natures within us, right? And well, there are probably lots of natures within us. And at the end of the day, is what you feed that sticks. So personally, there is, of course, that curiosity and that lean towards science just because of how my brain is wired. But then intrinsically as well, there is an entrepreneurial flow through that. So what I've probably not mentioned is as much as my mom is a scientist, she's also a business owner. She owns a pharmacy in Cameroon. So I grew up seeing my mom actually own a business. We were talking about P&Ls, run P&Ls every morning, running the accounts and making sure that every single thing is still on track and cash flow, looks good every single month. So there was that aspect of it. So when I think about that entrepreneurial thread, when I was in lower Sith, I think AS level, when everyone was doing DLV, we started a company where we're selling a tuck shop, because I was in boarding school in Reading, selling a tuck shop and selling Van Gogh hoodies with like pictures. And
So you
so
were selling things at school.
I was
Interesting.
selling things at school, not science things, but there was that thread that was already running through that. And that was what, 14, 15 at the time. And so that was something that I clearly had that mindset going in terms of how do you fill a gap. So there was that. But then if we take back the academic nature of what I was trained as, you plot that PhD. So during my PhD, 9 months into my PhD, I was clear that I love science, but I did not like academia in terms of the nature of the industry. And so the question I had to ask myself was, so what am I going to do with my life? And then that's where that intrinsic nature kicks in. So I started exploring careers outside of academia, and then I found consulting and quite a few other careers, right? But what that led to, which many people might not take that path, is starting a company, which is called the Northwest Biotech Initiative. It's still running till date. I don't run it. And now it currently runs as a student company. It's been running for the past 10 years. And we started it in 2014. And I say we, which is my co-founder and I at the time, Dr. Catherine Castillo at the time, started it. And essentially it was a company to support scientists to seek careers outside of academia. And we used to run events, get sponsorship from biotech companies within the area. So we were based in Liverpool. Well, I was based in Liverpool. She was based in Manchester, and we would run events every quarter. I think we were sponsored by Uni of Liverpool, Uni of Manchester. We raised thousands and thousands of pounds, and we had a consulting case competition, which we ran every year. And the winning team would take home £1,000. So we would raise funds for that. So
awesome. Did you run that as a charity, social enterprise, for profit? Like, how did you run that?
Ran it as a CIC. But then again, now we go into the business nature. We started having our KPIs as a recruitment company, because the what's in it for the companies to sponsor us was that they would then recruit on the back of attending our events, right? And it was like a fraction of the cost of what a typical recruitment company. Exactly. So from that perspective, I was like, okay, these KPIs and these numbers no longer work. And I was also getting into the final year of my PhD. I was like, okay, I should probably sit down and actually finish my PhD. Like, let's actually do this thing that we started. So off the back of that, we then closed it as a company, and then it became a student there's a student organization.
Yeah,
And
like yeah,
so,
part of
yeah.
the
And yeah, part of the union, exactly. And
yeah.
it's, yeah, still going, still running. I was back maybe 2 years ago to celebrate the 10th anniversary. They gave us
Wow.
this little plaques, like pioneers. I was like, wow, to think that
Wow.
it still exists. So yeah.
Wow. That must be so satisfying again to like go back and actually see the thing still running.
Absolutely. And seeing all the students coming in and just how much innovation has moved on, right? And
Yeah.
all the companies that are coming in, and there's so much stuff around the physics aspect of it, and like using lasers to do so many cool things. And I was like, goodness me, when I started, that's not what we were thinking, but these are the companies that are in the area. So yeah, that
Yeah.
was
So where did that entrepreneurial thread then take you?
where did it take me next? Well, that was basically the pause at that moment
Yeah, yeah.
from that. And I think I picked back up with my scientific lens, which was deploying to Guinea during the biggest Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which again was virtue of the fact that my lab, or my PI's lab, was a respiratory lab. And so when the Ebola outbreak hit in West Africa, the WHO and Public Health England reached out to him to ensure that how he could support with all the research we'd been doing. And so I volunteered to deploy. And those were
Wow.
probably some of the initial thoughts I started seeing around clinical trials. I was seeing clinical trials on ground, and yeah, lots of things that I did not particularly agree with. That's a whole other podcast in itself we can go into. So then that was the next, probably milestone that put the pin in my head around data, clinical trials, and all of this. Then I graduated in 2019. COVID hits 2020, and you would imagine with a PhD in infectious diseases, everyone is asking your
Hmm.
opinion around COVID. I
Hmm.
start working with the UK government and a couple of companies on COVID-19 vaccine uptake in Black and brown communities, or maybe the lack thereof. And then I started asking the questions around clinical trial makeup and having an understanding of what that looks like. At the time, I checked AstraZeneca, and I think at the time it was like 3% makeup from Black and brown communities. And I remember thinking, I am not going to be the one to engage and talk about this with communities, because I was receiving so much backlash. At least it felt like I was receiving a lot of backlash. And so, again, put a pin in that. And then I went into strategy consulting. And I worked at LEK Consulting, Guidehouse, which is Navigant. And through those, and that was really where I started seeing the commercialization of what is now SökerData, right? Which again is understanding the pain point, because obviously during COVID, everyone's trying to understand what's happening. Pharma is developing these vaccines, trying to get them to market. And FDA were putting regulations around access and clinical trial makeup. And that was the first time that I saw pharma companies sort of change the type of projects that I saw coming in. Having an understanding of, okay, what is health equity? How do we increase data sets from women and global majority populations and things like that? And that's when I thought, okay, I've seen this problem from different lenses, right? So through my PhD, I realized I didn't really delve too much in what I did with my PhD, but through my PhD, I saw that disparity in the data sets in communities. When engaging communities, I saw how that affected uptake. And then, of course, from a pharma perspective, I saw the commercialization opportunity. And then I thought, okay, let's figure out what SökerData would be. So yeah.
Wow, what a story. The clinical trials so your interest in clinical trials seems to have sparked uh, on the ground when you're dealing with Ebola, which is interesting. You then also talked about, well, later you talk about then the backlash from Black and brown communities and the poor uptake and, you know, lack of trust in those groups, with healthcare services obviously playing a massive part in that. Can you just talk me through? I know you don't want to share too much on this, and you said it's a whole nother podcast, but what was it that you didn't agree with from a clinical trials perspective in the Ebola crisis?
I didn't agree with the inclusion/exclusion criteria
Right,
and how it was being decided and who was deciding um, the inclusion/exclusion criteria.
right,
Essentially, what was clear was that there were clinical trials that were being run on ground, which, fine. Um, I say this as someone who, on our team, we were the first people to test out the MinION. I don't know if anyone knows about the Oxford Nanopore technologies and the portable MinION, where you can actually sequence genetic data on the go. So we were one of the first teams to do that in an outbreak setting. So this is 2015, and have an understanding of what that would look like, and getting all these long reads and directly translating that with public health experts to have an understanding of how you could trace back, right, and track where a specific virus was coming from and what tree that was coming from. And of course, how do we isolate those populations? So it was like the best case in real life technology, how we're using technology and innovation to directly affect and stop an outbreak. So there was a lot of that going on. So I'm not going to say that, technology cannot be deployed in a pandemic setting, but we're going to touch on it. That's where regulatory comes in. There are lots of things around regulatory, and probably why my interest again lays in a lot of the work that happens in Africa is again that regulatory barrier. So there were clinical trials that were being run, and what was clear was that the feeling on ground was that there was one specific clinical trial that was having a higher success rate.
Yeah.
And then when I say success rate in terms of recovery and in terms of actually moving out.
Yeah.
And there was one that was not.
Yeah.
And I still clearly remember my 22-year-old self asking, so why are we still enrolling patients in the one that we can see that is not working? Do we have the paperwork for it? And I essentially was told to just go back to my day job and focus on that. And so, there were lots of things like this that was happening. I still remember someone coming to our office. And by the way, to paint the picture, when I say office, picture a wooden tent that has been built up, in the middle of a pandemic. So it's not really an office. It's everyone sort of knew. I mean, it was an office, but it wasn't. Don't think, brick walls, etc. Think middle of nowhere, put in wood to be able to create spaces. So, we were testing for Ebola and malaria in our lab. So I went under the European Mobile Laboratory with the WHO. And so we were getting literally firsthand all the samples that were coming in for either Ebola or malaria. And so we, of course, had to be as careful as you could possibly imagine. And with a Ebola is CL4, right? But we were working in it in a created CL4, which was like a box. I think I posted one of these pictures on LinkedIn. And so I remember still sitting in our front room and testing away, and someone coming in and asking about some samples and some clinical trials that were ongoing. And I still remember our team lead at the time going, yeah, no, we're not doing that, and just shut it down. Right, exactly. So there were lots of things that were happening on ground, and those were the things that sort of started making me think, okay, hang on a minute, what is going on?
Is there, would they have argued there was an ethical justification for what they were doing? Would they have argued that?
Probably. I think what I did not do was actually go and find out which clinical trials or because we could not even, because at the end of the day it was all blinded, right? So from a patient perspective, everything was blinded. No one knew what they were getting enrolled over. But of course, I was staff. So there were questions that I could ask. And again, I was the only French-speaking person on the team. Again, the only African on the team. But I only say that to say that what that gave me access to was gaining a certain level of trust and understanding within the community that other people may not have had, right? And so there were certain questions that I could ask. And this is how I knew that there were certain trials that were ongoing that were working versus not working. And I did not double click on some of them. So till date, I can't even backtrack and understand. So I'm sure from a endpoint perspective, and this is where we start going into data sets, right? So I'm sure from an endpoint perspective, when you look at inclusion, exclusion criteria, you could probably say, yes, technically they fulfilled the criteria to enroll these patients, because maybe if they were specifically past a threshold, they were right to be enrolled into a specific clinical trial. But then again, as we all know, these data sets start from somewhere. So what were the data sets that they started with, and why were they not working within some populations versus others? These are questions that I don't know. I don't have the answers to.
It's funny because before we started recording, we started talking about how, it's not data itself that ends up being the interesting part of the conversation. It's actually it's the consequences. It's the consequences of how it's collected. It's the consequences of how it's managed. It's the consequences of the storytelling around it. I think that there's no more obvious example than this of how the handling of that data has actually just sparked this incredible passion in you to right some wrongs, essentially, of how the world is working. And I think it's not unrelated, is it, that the next thing that you talked about was, the mistrust from the Black and brown community with healthcare data, and the backlash you're going to receive, even from your coming from a position of everyone needs the vaccine here. But I imagine you also have a great deal of understanding as to why the lack of trust is there, because people might not know the studies that have gone on previously, infecting black populations with disease on purpose to study certain things, how blood has been frankly stolen and commercialized from black bodies that are able to fight off certain things. And people might not often realize that those are the origins of that. And so those things are indeed connected. And I can completely understand why you have a huge interest in this. And so SökerData, can you explain what problem it is you're solving specifically and how you are doing it?
Absolutely. Thanks, James. So what I came down to was having an understanding of where the data sets sit, so access to data sets, and then the use of the data sets, right, for these set consequences.
Mm.
And I say that because a lot of times when I've talked about why the problem exists. So we go back to my PhD. So we've talked about the Ebola epidemic in Guinea. We go back to my PhD and we're saying that this hypothesis is we're due another pandemic. And so we need to be able to find out specific biomarkers that could be used to triage a specific subpopulation. Great. We get data sets and samples from Great Ormond Street Ardehey Hospital. And I'm like, great, we have these samples. We're going to run proteomics, genomics, so understanding of the proteins, understanding of the genes, and actually connect them to clinical data and start seeing what biomarker profiles are coming out. I'm like, great, we're going to do this analysis. And I then turn around to my supervisor, my PI at the time, and I went, this is great, but like, would this work for someone like me? And he was like, oh, good question. So, but we need data to be able to add to this cohort, to be able to understand if your profile will be the same or different. Where do we get that data set from? And then again, because I am the curious, nerdy kid that I am, the summer before, I had volunteered at the Institut Pasteur in Dakar, Senegal, which is a huge site for flu monitoring in West Africa.
Wow.
I reached out to the previous supervisor and I was like, I need data sets from the geographical region, specifically from Senegal. And yes, people that look like me, can I have data? Can I have samples? Can you collaborate? And he was like, okay, what do we need to put in place? And so that was how I ended up including data sets specifically from a Senegalese population or from people within that area, because again, Institut Pasteur Dakar doesn't only do Senegal, it does lots of like West Africa, and then having an understanding. And when we ended up pulling those data sets together, there were 56% from a Black ethnicity, and we found specific biomarkers that had not been found before when it comes to flu, when we analyzed them according to ethnicity and gender. Yes. And then I went,
I mean, it's not surprising though, is it? Like, I'm looking surprised, but it's not surprising.
it's not. But then it's like, you know, something theoretically, and then you see
Yeah,
it
this is
it's like
yeah.
that
Like cognitive, you know that should be the case. Why am I surprised? Yeah.
but then you're like, oh, yeah, there's a real issue here. If this is
Yeah.
what we're finding. And so
Yeah.
we found 11 proteins that were significantly different, could be potential biomarkers. I mean, as far as PhDs go, that was the end of that. But so tying back into the problem we're solving, the problem then became, okay, lots of people are saying that they want access to these data sets and they want to include these cohorts, but they don't know where to access these data sets from. So I thought, okay, fine, we're going to aggregate these data sets, we're going to source these data sets, pull them under one house. But more so, we're going to analyze them in context. And why is that important? Because what could be an anomaly within one data set could be an absolute trend in another data set. It just depends on which data set that specific data point sits in. And so the problem is that SökerData is solving is one, the access to data, two, the understanding of data, and then of course the use of the data set. So what that just means is we are aggregating data sets specifically from focusing on women and global majority populations. And then we're looking at starting with breast cancer, cardiovascular diseases. We're going to look at some metabolic diseases in the future. And we're really trying to access a range of both publicly available data sets, but also proprietary data sets. So that means lots of partnerships with hospitals, partnerships at a national level, partnerships with charities, and just being able to say, okay, the question of, I don't know where to access that data, we've got it, here it is. So there's no longer the excuse, or not just the excuse, the rebuttal of, I just don't have access to that data, I can't include it. It's like, well, here you go. Now, if you don't include it, that's a choice that you've made, rather than, I just could not find it. So, yeah.
That is fascinating. So who exactly is the customer for you?
Great question. So when we started, my ICP in my head was R&D teams, which was R&D teams were developing specifically a drug who are about to go into clinical trial. This is pre-phase 1, going into humans, and they're trying to have an understanding of, will this drug work within the subpopulation or not, right? And using these cohorts to have an understanding, basically making risk decisions, no-go decisions, right?
Yes.
So I say that was what it was at the beginning, because as with businesses, the commercialization of that, I found that slightly more lengthy, / the problem was still hypothetical, because you're still future planning a problem, right? And of course, from a commercial perspective, you're looking at someone who has a problem today that needs to be solved right now, right? And so when I did some more commercialization conversations, I realized that those who actually had the biggest problem were pharma companies who had a drug that was already past clinical trial phase 3, for example. I was maybe about to come to market, but they had missed out on some data sets that they needed it either for regulatory purposes, or they needed those data sets to be able to have an understanding of how to market and position the drug. There we started seeing a huge uptake, and that was all the inbound.
By the way, not because they want the drug to be better, but in order to get over a hurdle to commercialize it. So I'm just going to draw attention to that for a second. But we can complain about the moral stuff maybe a bit later. It's in vain, isn't it? Like, anyway, the key is obviously matching the incentives to the morality. If we do that, then at least, which they are here, I guess, is the positive thing to say.
Exactly. And that's what we're trying to do at the moment, just doing that matching process. But I mean, I say trying to do, we've been, for how old we are, we've been pretty successful in being able to engage the right pharma companies and who are willing to go through the processes to include these specific data sets. And so we're basically at the real world evidence teams is where I would put us in. So real world evidence teams. And then of course now with the uptake of AI, we're now seeing med tech coming in, having interest in trying to understand, okay, how do we even train our AIs? How do we train that? But the conversation around AI today was not where it was 2 years ago, at least for me, right? So we're obviously evolving with that conversation and making sure that we can continuously serve these ICPs.
How long have you been running SökerData?
Goodness me, in May will be 3 years.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
June, 3 years.
3 years. That's awesome. And why SökerData? I've tried Googling soccer or circa, as it looks like, if you the umlauts from German, I guess, over the O, but that's over a U, isn't it, in German? But anyway, can't seem to find the answer, because I was thinking, is there a historical figure called this that or something? But I don't know.
No, so the inspiration behind that was just, I was trying to find something that meant to seek, because what we're doing is seeking data, right? And so I looked for the names in like Latin and Greek, all like some of these other names. And there were two things that were driving my decision making. One, I didn't want like a .tech / .ai type of name. And it was like, no. And then the other point was I wanted to ensure that, yes, today we're B2B. if we ever went B2C, it was something that could still take, right? That
Yeah,
could
nice.
still be used in like everyday language. And so my previous flatmate is Norwegian. And so she was like, "Oh, have you checked in Norwegian?" I was like, "Of course I have not." Like, it's
Nice.
not the language that I
It's
would
not commonly
start
done, no.
with. But I did, and then it was available. And so soccer is Swedish to actually mean, so Norwegian and Swedish are quite similar from what I understand. It means to seek. So it means, so soccer data means to seek data.
Lovely, lovely. Can you talk me through an example of maybe an insight or a biomarker or something along those lines, that's something that has been some practical what has reached clinic here? Like, how do those insights actually reach the patient and make meaningful change? Have you got an example of how your product, I guess, has been used in that way?
Oh, good question. I wouldn't say we have an example of how something has reached in clinic, right? Because again, the clinical trial process in itself is like 10 years long. So
Indeed.
even if anyone
You're
was
already
to
3
use
years old, so yeah.
exactly, we're only 3 years old. So even if anyone wants to use our data sets, last year, I wouldn't find out till probably about 10 years in. But what we're directly seeing at the moment is how it's directly supporting patient engagement, how it's directly
Ah,
elevating patient experience, how it's directly allowing pharma companies to understand what and where some pain points exist specifically for subpopulations. So a case of current client that we're working with, they're working in the stroke space, and they're specifically wanting to use our data sets for women and ethnic minorities. So we're really focusing on the stroke outcomes from women and Latinx and African American, because the study is specifically focused in the US. And this again is to have an understanding of what is their patient preference for specific medications? Are there adverse events that have happened or occurred in previous drugs that have been taken, and things like that. And so that's directly informing if a drug can be prescribed or should be prescribed to a specific subset of the population or not, or allowing them to think through that whole process. So that's sort of where we're seeing that at the moment in terms of direct patient output. Then the flip side of that is that we're currently running a study in Nigeria, and where we're seeing the interesting part is from a clinician's perspective. So we're seeing clinicians actually say that study specifically focused on breast cancer. So when they're going from a diagnostic perspective, they're seeing differences in, let's say, biomarkers versus treatment responses. So let's say treatment pathways, perhaps if a patient tests positive for a BRCA1 biomarker, for example, there's a specific treatment pathway that they have to follow. And what they're seeing from using our data sets is that there's some patients that are, yes, following that treatment pathway and that response and that outcome. And there's some patients that are completely deviating from that. And so exactly. So from that perspective, the question, I just said exactly because of James's nod, anyone who's listening and not watching. And so what that will be interesting to see is that if we were to further subtype those patients that are not following that treatment pathway, are there further mutations there that could probably suggest that they should be on a different treatment pathway, and then they're actually not potentially just BRCA1, right? What is the further subtype that we can see from there? So at the moment, that's sort of where we're seeing that in that direct application of
yeah.
it. And I think lastly is just having, from a patient perspective, just being able to have an understanding of adverse events. A question that I get all the time is this typical in people that look like me? Like,
Yeah.
what are other people saying around that? Like, if someone took this treatment, should I be experiencing this? And so, yeah,
It helps build trust, doesn't it? I think
exactly.
that's the other thing. That's sort of the the business that you're in almost. It's funny. I speak to Malone quite a lot, who wrote the Mind the Gap book, the dermatology book, and I still honestly find it wild that it took until, what was it, 2021 for that book to be written. It's frankly unbelievable. And just back to this thing about the lack of trust between those populations and the healthcare system. There's a long way to go. There's a really, really long way to go, and it is incredibly important work that you're doing. On many levels, I think, yes, there is the commercial viability of the model, and thankfully, yes, those incentives are aligned. If you want something to change the exam, change the measurement, and then people end up learning it or doing it, right? So it's always that's the thing we need to focus on, and that's why policy is important, by the way. It's why lobbying is important for change at that kind of level, because if you change the tick boxes, different boxes have to get ticked. It doesn't matter why. I don't care about the morality. If at the end of the day you still have to tick the box, let's get the right boxes on the page that need to be ticked. And that's why I think that policy work is still incredibly important, if slow moving, but just important to change. So it's unbelievably important work. And because you're such an expert in this, I'm wondering what you think about where we're at in the UK and how far we have to go on that. Because obviously there's a long journey here. And this isn't going to be changed overnight. This data gap is talked about in women's health a lot. It's talked about in minority groups a lot. That there is such a long way to go. Where do you think we are as a community, as a country, maybe, in how we're set up to address that gap? And what, if anything, do you think needs to be done further?
From a cultural perspective, we clearly understand the problem and we know the problem. And I say this, actually, I should probably say this cautiously, because again, I know that my newsfeed on my LinkedIn is obviously very clearly biased because of the work that I do. And so even a lot of the events that I go to, still understand that lots of people in there are still early adopters, right? Even within the whole UK ecosystem. So, but okay, if we say generally, I think we know or understand the problem. Now, where, in my opinion, we're falling short is very much on the implementation of it. So I think we're talking earlier on, we give a couple of examples. One is access to data, right? If we take just access to data sets within the UK as it stands today, the UK is known as a science super house, and it's like, yep, great, we have access, we have data sets, we have access to it. And lots of people talk about Genomics England, the UK Biobank, Our Future Health, and CPRD, and quite a few other sources to have access to data sets.
And on the face of it, by the way, fantastic news coming out of those places. Fantastic news coming out of those places. We've reported it on here. We've reported it in Healthtech Pigeon, just saying, all this data exists. UK is going to be this amazing hub for data. Like, yeah, I'm with you so far.
Exactly. On the face of it. Now you double click or you dig further. Access to data sets, specifically from the likes of Genomics England, probably takes about 2 to 6 months. That's number one. And that is from an application process to actually having access to data sets. And again, they're all within secure data environments. When you look at some of these institutions that I have mentioned, there is none that you can have access to, let's say, next week. Right. Like the availability of these data sets are not as instant as the headlines may make it appear. Okay. So you're looking at at least 12 weeks up until 6, heck, probably 18 months, right? Yeah. To actually have access to some of these data sets. So what does that do for anyone who's innovating in the UK landscape? That is a massive blocker to be able to have access to it. I was at a women's and healthcare event last night, and some women said that they had to go to the US, for example, to all of us research data to be able to have access to data sets to train some of their models for 2 reasons. One, the speed and efficiency to be able to have access to these data sets. They were looking at 2 to 4 weeks turnaround time to have access to these data sets in comparison to 6 to 9. Like, that is huge. That's a difference between a business surviving. And
a startup, definitely with seed funding, 100%.
Startup, exactly. I mean, and then 2 was the makeup of this data set. And I think that's where we go to the second part of the UK challenge. Yes, we have access to these data sets, but who is represented in these data sets? And I think that's something that absolutely everyone needs to ask. Data sets within Genomics England, within the UK Biobank, are still very much, I think, less than 10% from Black and ethnic minority populations. And we even look at it from a gender perspective, still significantly lower. So yes, you may have access to these data sets, but what are those data sets? What are the data sets you're actually having access to? But then you look at it even further down the line, what can you do with these data sets, right? Which we're talking about, which is that the consequence of these data sets, lots of them, the IP still is probably co-owned with these institutions, open source, having to report these insights back within with these institutions, which I know others may argue that, yes, you have to maintain that open source ability and have everyone access to it. Great, but then from a commercial perspective, how do we then actually use that to commercialize actual innovation that can be that can stand within the global market? And I think that those are some specific key points where we're currently failing as a country.
What is the answer to that? How can you then use it to commercialize?
I don't know that I don't know that you can use it to commercialize, but I think you can use it to start training a model from a research perspective layer, and then build on top of that. So perhaps you can look at it as a foundational model. So you can look at it as a start to allow you to develop something that can hopefully you can add on other data sets. But I think what it keeps coming back to is that data set is not going to be enough for you to commercialize. It will be enough probably for you to build that first iteration, but you would need to find other data sets to be able to commercialize.
And what would need to change? So is this a mindset thing? But so I'm thinking now about how, you see all this stuff that's saying, oh, the NHS has got so much data in it. Like once we get to the stage where we can sandbox all this data and everyone can use it, and we're going to build so much stuff. And so is what you're saying that there's actually just a fundamental approach to the way that we deal with data currently that actually that isn't as true as we would like it to be? Because I'll be honest, when something sounds too good to be true, it often is. And so when people are like, oh, don't worry, every single bit of NHS data is just going to be able to be in this central place and secure data environment, everyone's going to go in there and be able to deal with it and train models and is there just a philosophy that we have on data currently that would need to change?
I think it's beyond the philosophy of data. I think it's just how generally the UK mindset operates on innovation. Because if you start at the beginning, which is what is the end goal, right? What are we solving for? Yes, we're solving for hopefully commercialization, because that's the only way we maintain some sort of economic, power. But also, yes, we're solving for research and advancing research. If we stay at just advancing research, which yes, we are excellent at within the UK, we can't spit on that, then okay, fine, as we are, then we're great to keep on going. But until we can flip that mindset and take it a step further, which I think is a general UK problem within the entrepreneurial ecosystem, I think, no, actually, we're not just solving for research, we're solving for commercialization, to own a position and to really take that position in terms of scientific innovation. Until we can switch that mindset, then we then start trickling down to, okay, so what does that mean for the rules and regulations we're putting out around access to data, around policies, around what people can do around data sets, right? So as we were saying, FDA at the moment has changed a lot of their laws where a lot of things some AI can actually end up in the market with little or minimal review processes.
Yeah.
I have lots of thoughts around that, but I think
there are some positives, there are some negatives. Sometimes maybe good, sometimes.
And it's true, right? But I think that what that signal that clearly sends is that we are here for innovation first.
Yeah, I hear
rightly
you.
or wrongly. We're here for innovation first, rightly or wrongly.
Yeah.
And we will fix whatever problems that land in the market later on, or it will end up in being someone else's problem, right? And again, that's the US's stance. At least that's the stance they've taken, and that's clearly reflected in their policies. So is that what is maintaining them in being the house that, the power innovation house that we can argue whether the US still is the economic powerhouse that it thinks it is versus not, but at least it is a stance that they're currently taking. And I think that from a UK perspective, we keep dancing around the same issue. And I don't think that that's just a UK perspective. I think that's a Europe perspective and a European mindset. I was at Festival of Politics in November. Festival of Politics is run by the European Commission. They do it every year, bringing together European top leaders, politicians, heads of state. And the conversation last year, because it holds in November every year, was you had one of the co-founders of Mistral, can't remember his name on the top of my mind, Mistral AI. And he was specifically talking about, we can say what we want to say about the US, but it's pushing Europe to think about owning our own AI infrastructure, owning our own defense, security, things like that. A lot of the data sets that we're using currently to understand and track Ukraine, for example, was coming from, US powerhouses. And the conversation around the table was, okay, what if the current US president or some of his counterparts decided to just turn a switch off? What would that look like for Europe? And from what I am seeing, some of the comments coming out of Davos is still similar to that it's pushing us to own our own infrastructure, our own policies around AI. And I think that is as true as for the UK as it is for Europe, right? Until we're able to own this data set and think about how we commercialize it, we will just end up being a great research powerhouse that lots of entrepreneurs leave at some point.
Yes, because we have to get. We had Harvinder on the Healthtech Vision podcast talking about this, that we have to consider if the UK what part of this conversation we actually want to be in, because we're not going to win on the processing power. Like we're just not. We're not going to. Nvidia's not a UK company. Like, I mean, OpenAI's not, and Google's not, and like all these. We're just not. We're just not going to compete there. And so, actually, where can we compete? Particularly in healthcare, of course, we do have the NHS, and we can create data there. So can we be the data provider to a lot of this? And actually, is that where we fit? Question mark. Then OpenAI comes out and just says, just put all your data in here voluntarily, UK guys. Like, although it's not available in the UK, I think I VPN'd it to get on the waiting list from the US.
Oh, wow!
Just to get on the list and have a look at it. But yeah, it's super super interesting. I mean, do you clearly feel, because there's a lot. There's a lot in here about you clearly feeling this viscerally, like it's almost like you're being held back, like almost you can sense it in the frustration in the way that you're speaking, I guess. When are you going to move to China? Like when's that coming?
That's a thought. That's a question I was having, a conversation I was having in the
Really?
first year. And no, I'll move to China. But the question very much is, how do we bring that in? I think the frustration, right, comes from a lot of places. A couple of them being, one, I've been in this industry for the past easily since I was 22. It literally is. And that is over 10 years now, and then almost 10 years now. And again, within being in science even longer than that, right? I started learning about precision medicine over 10 years ago. Yeah. So it's having seen the potential of it, and I think that's always a frustration, and then not seeing it being realized. And I think that those are the key parts to play here. And I've always sat at the intersection of entrepreneurship, science, and policymaking. Because I think they all affect each other, and we have to continuously, or at least I have to continuously switch hats, because one policy could literally tank my business, or could make my business. It's constantly thinking about that and being up to date with that. So it's.
I think the other thing as well, also, is that we talk about the consequences as well. The consequences of all that is a level of injustice that is quite difficult to swallow as well. I think that for me is why this grinds my gears, is that I struggle. Historically, whenever I see injustice, I massively overreact and create 10 times the amount of problems myself. And not even injustice towards myself, it's generally injustice towards others, and I just get involved in things I shouldn't. And so actually it's one of those things for me personally that I think I see here, is that the consequence of this inertia, let's call it, is a level of injustice that doesn't justify keep maintaining that inertia. I think what's interesting is that there is open still the call for evidence on the regulation of AI from the MHRA. I don't know if have you been involved in this? Are you submitting to this? What's your relationship with this call for evidence?
I've not been involved in the creation of it, but definitely putting together a submission and evidence for it.
Yeah.
I mean, the deadline is the 2nd of Feb, so it's on my to-do list before the end of the week. And the points that I'm essentially trying to pull through are, of course, one, specific access to data, but again, specifically our speed to market and efficiency. I was just trying to find specific numbers, just why again, you may have seen this if you're listening, you wouldn't know I was scrolling. But one of the a point that an article that I read 2 days ago probably was around clinical trials within the UK, right? So it takes on average 186 days to initiate a clinical trial in the UK. 186 days.
To initiate?
To initiate a clinical trial in the UK.
Yeah.
Now, compare that to some of our neighbors. Germany, it takes 92 days.
Half.
Italy, France, okay, 120, 141, 140 days, right? Okay, so if you compare us to Italy, one could say, okay, we're not so far off. You compare us to Germany, we're literally double the time. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that for a pharmaceutical company that actually wants to initiate a study that could actually potentially benefit trials and populations in the UK, would they want to spend 186 days trying to negotiate
6 months.
6 months trying to negotiate launching a trial here than going to Germany? That's going to take them 90 days, half the time, to be able to figure that out. So when we're talking about the cost of this, as we were talking about the inertia and the lack of and the speed to market, it literally is directly affecting patients. Lack of access to specific potential life-saving medications and treatment options. So that's definitely one of the things that I would like to bring into that call for evidence, in terms of, if we don't, we're seeing exactly the same thing that has played out in clinical trials. It's just going to play out again in this, in this AI race, right? But what was also interesting within this specific article was looking at, which again, I can send it to you, you can link it if anyone wants to read it, is one of the reports was that research is still viewed as a nice to have in the NHS. And so if it's a nice to have, when budgets go and we all know the cost cuts and everything that is happening, of course, it's just not going to continuously move forward. And the feeling was that, yes, everything could be running fine, but then once you start trying to engage different NHS trusts, time just balloons. So that's specifically happening in England. What was interesting was that Scotland and Wales actually have standardized costings that are currently working. So they have no site level variations. So it's one contract for all, standardized costings. So following the successful models that obviously has happened in Scotland and Wales, having speed as a KPI, specifically looking at how can we actually making sure that from that beginning initiation to actualization is as efficient as possible, and it's not a side project, right? And so I think that these are some of the things that are key in when we're thinking about how we're actually bringing these things to market. Otherwise, we'll just keep losing to our neighbors.
I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, but if you were to, I don't want to say call out, but like who's got the most responsibility here? Do you think? I know there's a lot of shared responsibility between government and pharma, and there's a lot of different places where you could land responsibility here. But who holds the cards? Who holds an ability to actually make change here? Is it policymakers? Is it like where do you think the most gain for the least effort is? Who holds the ring here?
I think you said it already, which is when you put specific boxes that have to be ticked. Eventually, somehow they then get ticked. And so if that's what it's going to take, then that is what it should take. So whether that is from a policymaker's perspective, whether that is from an MHRA perspective, I don't know if it's an MHRA that holds the card to be able to put that as a metric to potentially even examine NHS trusts, right? Yes, you might have, I don't know what KPIs NHS trusts are, so if anyone listening, it'd be great to learn, but potentially engagement in clinical trials and speed to actualization could become a key metric so that it incentivizes everybody to be able to do that. But then again, of course, the question with that comes with budgets, right?
Of course.
Because who is going to actually do, whose
We got
job
enough
is
to
that,
do,
right?
which they do. Yeah.
Exactly.
More targets. Awesome. Yeah. And what are you most excited about at the minute with everything that you've got going on and everything that's going on in the company? Let's end this on a positive. What's something that you're positively excited about?
Honestly, that there are actually quite a few early adopters, and there are people who are interested in the topic area. Women's health is not as niche as people make it to think. Surprise, surprise. And global majority populations are actually global majority globally. So we need data sets. So I am quite excited by the fact that there seem to be not just talkers, doers, right? So that's both from a pharma perspective. Even the fact that the call is currently open, of course, we've had this great conversation and one could call it critique, but at least it's there. We get to give feedback
Yeah.
and at least the conversation is happening. I think moving away from the constant, like, we have to be politically correct and agree with everything, that's just, it's like change and movement has to happen. And that's by us having these conversations and by these calls being open and people being early adopters. So yeah, that I'm excited about. Like, there's lots happening. We can go faster. I'm always like, guys, we can go faster. Let's go. So, yeah.
Elsa, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for coming on and talking about this. And thank you for your honesty and your candor. And frankly, for the education. I think it's been one that I've definitely learned a lot from. If people want to get in touch with you to learn a bit more, they want to learn about SökerData, or they want to ask you a question, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Absolutely. I am Dr. Elsa Zekeng on LinkedIn, probably the best way to reach me. And yeah, my LinkedIn is open.
Awesome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, James.